How does one man rise from the fringes of the Roman elite to rule a republic that swore it would never have another king again? Well, Julius Caesar conquered new lands for sure, but he also did something even more impressive in a way, which was conquer how people thought about power itself. One of my favorite authors is Robert Greene, and one of my favorite books is The 48 Laws of Power. And 2,000 years before Robert Greene wrote that book, Julius Caesar was living by many of these laws through sheer instinct. Caesar understood spectacle, manipulation, and timing, probably better than anyone before, and maybe even anyone since. But what fascinates me most is this: Caesar followed almost every law of power flawlessly until the end, and the few ones that he broke got him killed. Let's start with law number 6, court attention at all costs. When Caesar was born around 100 BC, his family name was old, but they were effectively broke. He was a patrician by blood, but his family had become somewhat irrelevant. He needed to create a new reputation from nothing and redefine his family's legacy. And from the start, he grasped something Rome rewarded: attention. In a city that loved theater, he learned to make himself the show. It started with how he presented himself. He always dressed sharply, spoke with clean articulation, and he acted like a man already destined for greatness. But importantly, he wasn't chasing approval. In fact, he was often mocked for his style, but he was building spectacle from an early age. The first time we really see this come into play was when he refused Sulla's order to divorce his wife Cornelia, and this nearly got him killed. He went on the run and was eventually pardoned, but it made him famous for courage and loyalty. Even his enemies could admire the sheer nerve of this young man. Later, when he became aedile, he borrowed unimaginable sums to stage games that dazzled Rome from Crassus. To Caesar, the debt didn't really mean anything. He understood that image was everything, and the crowds began to love him. Caesar understood that reputation was worth more than gold, which is also law 5, guard your reputation with your life, which, to be honest, at times he didn't. We know he was a serial womanizer and slept with many senators' wives, which would have harmed his reputation and made him many enemies. But nonetheless, he rose step by step through the ladder of offices as a priest, lawyer, governor, and general, and every move was theater. Caesar wasn't just a politician, he was a personal brand. And in the modern world of personal branding, he'd be a billionaire. In a republic that was addicted to personality, he made himself indispensable. Law 7, get others to do the work, but always take the credit. Caesar's real leap came in 58 BC when he's given command of Gaul. It should have been a routine governorship, just another Roman governor extracting tribute and making himself wealthy in the process. But Caesar saw something nobody else did: the chance to craft his legend. Crucially, he didn't just fight the wars in Gauls, he wrote them. The Commentari, the Bello Gallico, his commentaries, are his own dispatches from the front. They're the ancient world's version of a viral marketing campaign. In them, he was clear, heroic, actually deceptively modest, which is also very clever, and written in the third person, so he sounded more objective. Caesar did this, Caesar repelled that, but every line told the people of Rome, I am Rome's destiny. He let his legates win the skirmishes, then presented their victories as his own. Although, to his credit, he was also a brilliant soldier and commander, and we do have numerous instances where he fought side by side with his men, inspiring leadership and loyalty. So he wasn't just all talk. Crucially, he did back it up with action. He was really the ultimate man of action, and that's law 7 to perfection. But he also applied law 32, play to the people's fantasies. The Roman crowd didn't just want safety in the republic, they wanted glory, and Caesar gave them a story where he was the hero, civilizing barbarians and avenging the republic. His landings in Britain also added to this. To the Romans, this would have been the equivalent of the moon landings, a new land only talked about in rumor and whisper. You also have to note his daring and bravery here. He took great personal risk and put himself in great danger with these attempted invasions. And although they largely didn't achieve much, the media spin made him a hero. The genius was that he made conquest sound like service to the people. Even cruelty became necessity, and there were plenty of times where that was the case too. But equally, every risk became fate, and by the time he returned, Gaul wasn't just pacified, he was a legend. Law 28. Enter action with boldness. In 49 BC, his enemies in the Senate had grown nervous. Pompey, once his ally, turned against him. They ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome, and everyone knew what that meant, especially Caesar. There would be a trial, likely exile, or maybe even worse. Most men would have hesitated, but Caesar acted decisively. He took one legion, crossed the Rubicon River, which was the legal boundary generals were forbidden to cross, and reportedly said the words, Elea iacta est, the die is cast. Even knowing how bold Caesar was, this would have shocked even Pompey. Caesar always understood that hesitation could kill faster than inaction. and that even the wrong decision is better than no decision. And while the Senate bickered amongst themselves, Caesar was moving towards Rome. Within weeks, Rome was his. And unlike Sulla before him, there were no mass proscriptions, no massacres, no terror. There was just Caesar and control. But this moment also foreshadowed the law that he would later break. Law 47. In victory, learn when to stop. And Caesar never really did, but we'll get back to that. Law 12. Use selective honesty and generosity to disarm your enemies. Caesar's mercy became legendary, but it was also a strategy. Caesar was deeply pragmatic. He was never cruel unless it was useful, and same with his clemency and generosity. When he defeated Pompey's forces in the Civil War, he pardoned thousands of enemies. He let men like Brutus and Cassius live, gave them offices, and even treated them as friends. Public perception here was that this was noble, generous Caesar, which would have separated him from the fear of Sulla, who Caesar very clearly didn't want to be like. It's definitely about control, but there's an element of sentiment here too, I think. Caesar was sad upon hearing of Pompey's death, and it did seem likely that he valued the lives of Romans and Roman senators, especially Brutus, who he did view in many ways as his stepson. But that's Law 12. Mercy makes men dependent. A living rival who owes you his life can be more useful than a dead one. But of course, mercy has its limits, and on the flip side, by breaking Law 15, crush your enemy totally, he sowed the seeds of his own murder. He thought gratitude would outweigh pride, but it rarely ever does. Those he spared will be the ones to kill him. Law 37. Create compelling spectacles. Back in Rome, Caesar knew power was as much about performance as it was policy. His triumphs were cinematic events. I mean, the loot of Gaul, the captives, the banners, even Cleopatra, his lover, and the Queen of Egypt appeared as part of the story. He rebuilt the Forum, reformed the calendar, launched colonization schemes, and everything he did had scale and mass and gravity to it. He made himself the axis of Roman life, and that's Law 34. Act like a king to be treated like one, which also unsettled Rome's elite. But the more perfect the performance became, the more fragile it was. He wore the laurel crown constantly, partly, apparently, to hide his baldness, we don't know that for sure, but partly because it looked divine. Statues of him appeared beside those of gods, and people started calling him Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. He even wore purple regularly, a colour often reserved for royalty. And here he broke Law 46, never appear too perfect. Rome didn't mind greatness, but it hated kings. And in this he'd forgotten Law 38, think as you like but behave like others. And this is where Augustus later learned from Caesar's mistakes. Augustus always acted like Rome was still a republic, though in practice he was the emperor. But in a republic built on envy, perfection can be a provocation. Law 29. Plan all the way to the end. For all his genius, Caesar never planned for what came next. In many ways, he was very reactive. Even looking at Gaul, he initially wanted to campaign in the Balkans, but the migration of the Helvetii took his attention. And then coming back to Rome, he wanted to be consul again. We have no real proof he actually wanted to be king. In fact, being called a king was a major insult, and knowing how careful he was about his reputation, he probably wouldn't have wanted that. And then for the future, he had no real legitimate heir. His only son, Caesarion, was with Cleopatra in Egypt, and politically this would have been impossible. His chosen successor was his teenage great-nephew Octavian, but no one had really heard of him at this point. The entire state depended on one man, and this broke the rule of longevity. The Roman Republic was now running on his energy. Once he was gone, it quickly collapsed. And I wonder if he sensed it, because in 44 BC, paranoia looked like it was setting in. He was ignoring omens. It was reported that his wife had a dream that he was going to be killed. He was dismissing warnings. He was brushing off friends who were telling him that the danger was close to home. He had no bodyguard. And when he entered the theatre of Pompey and the Ides of March, he walked straight into a conspiracy led by the very men he had spared. His reported last words, E tu Brutus, you too Brutus, highlights that he was almost caught off guard by this, that he really genuinely didn't think that they would go ahead with a conspiracy, especially by the men who he had spared. Law 47, never go past the mark you had aimed for. That's the final irony. Caesar's undoing wasn't failure, it was excess. He had won the game, but he didn't stop playing, or at the very least, he didn't adapt to the new rule set. He crossed every river, won every war, and charmed every crowd, but the same daring that made him unstoppable also made him overreach. He had just become too visible, too perfect, and too divine. And when mortals start to look godlike, someone always feels like the chosen one to remind them that they still bleed. And with his new plan to avenge Crassus and Parthia, which may have solidified his legend and truly made him untouchable, the conspirators had to act. The senators stabbed him 23 times, and in that act they proved how right he'd been about human nature. They thought they were restoring the Republic, but in truth they actually paved the way for the Empire. Caesar's death showed that once people have seen what absolute strength looks like, they won't accept anything weaker. And within a generation, his heir Octavian became Augustus, the first emperor, and Rome would never look back. So what made Caesar a genius? Well, he understood that power isn't about orders or laws, it's about perception. He lived Law 6 long before it was written, and he had mastered Law 7, 12, 28, and 37 without ever reading a book about them. He built loyalty through shared struggles, legitimacy through his image, and control through his mercy. He wielded impeccable charm, timing, and spectacle like weapons. But in the end, he broke the crucial laws that keep power alive. Never appear too perfect, crush your enemy totally, and plan all the way to the end. Caesar wasn't destroyed by his enemies. He was actually destroyed by his own success. Which is an odd contradiction. He'd outshone every master, conquered every rival, and convinced the world he was untouchable. And that is the most dangerous illusion of all. Maybe that's why I find him so fascinating. He didn't just rule these men, he was able to rewire what they thought about power. And 2,000 years later, we're still quoting him, copying his image, and playing his game. Julius Caesar didn't just change Rome, he changed the way power itself is performed. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next one.